Hey guys, something as simple as staying warm sounds almost ordinary to us now. But in medieval Europe it was often a quiet, daily struggle shaped by smoke, damp walls, expensive fuel, and long dark hours that seemed to settle into everything people owned. So before we begin, let me know where you're watching from, and tell me what piece of history you'd like us to explore next. If you enjoy this kind of thoughtful long-form history, a like is a lovely way to support the channel. And if calm, quietly fascinating stories from the past are your kind of thing, subscribe for more. To understand why warmth was so difficult to hold on to in medieval Europe, it helps to begin not with winter itself, but with the house. Modern people tend to imagine cold as an outdoor problem. In the medieval world, it followed you inside. It entered through gaps in timber, through badly fitted shutters, through thin roofs, through packed earth floors, through stone that seemed to store the chill rather than resist it. And perhaps most importantly, people lived in buildings that were not designed around the expectation of steady indoor comfort. That point matters because if we begin with the wrong assumption, almost everything else about medieval winter life seems irrational. In reality, much of it made practical sense within the limits people faced. For most of the population, especially peasants and laborers, home was not a sealed refuge from the weather. It was a working space, a storage space, sometimes a shelter shared with animals, and only after that a place of rest. The line between indoors and outdoors could be surprisingly thin. A small timber house with wattle and daub walls might do a respectable job against wind in good conditions, but not enough to create the kind of warm, stable atmosphere a modern listener would picture. Smoke from the hearth might hang in the rafters. Moisture from breath, cooking, muddy boots, wet wool, and livestock could accumulate. If the season turned harsh, the cold did not arrive dramatically in a single gust. It settled in slowly and stayed. Stone buildings, often imagined as stronger and grander, could be even worse in certain ways. Castles, manor houses, and urban stone homes had obvious advantages in status and durability, but thick masonry was not the same as insulation. A large stone hall could feel majestic in summer and punishing in winter. The cold pressed itself into the walls and lingered there. Great fireplaces might blaze, but their warmth often remained local. A lord seated near the fire experienced a very different winter from a servant crossing the room, sleeping in an outbuilding, or carrying water before dawn. So even in the homes of the wealthy, warmth was uneven, partial, and closely tied to rank. That is one of the first quiet truths beneath the subject. Warmth was not merely a matter of weather. It was also a matter of access. Access to fuel, access to better cloth, access to enclosed chambers, access to servants who could keep a fire alive, and access to food sufficient enough to help the body endure the season. Winter exposed social hierarchy in the most physical possible way. The rich were not necessarily comfortable by modern standards, but they could usually purchase layers of protection that the poor could not. The hearth stood at the center of this world, both practically and symbolically. It was the heart of the home, the place for cooking, heat, light, and family gathering. But a hearth was not a modern heating system. Open fires lost an astonishing amount of heat. Smoke had to go somewhere, and in simpler dwellings it often drifted upward only imperfectly, staining beams and irritating eyes and lungs. Even where chimneys existed, and they became more common over time, their presence did not guarantee an evenly warmed house. A fire warmed bodies nearest to it. It dried damp clothes if there was enough fuel to spare. It offered comfort, yes, but within a narrow circle. And fuel itself was never a trivial matter. It had to be collected, cut, stored, protected from damp, and rationed. In forested areas, access could still be limited by custom, law, or lordship. In towns, people often had to buy firewood or other fuel, and that cost mattered. Peat could be used in some regions. Charcoal had advantages in certain contexts. Brush, straw, and dry dung were also burned where necessary. None of this suggests a romantic, glowing winter. It suggests constant calculation. How much could be burned today? How much had to be saved for later? How cold did it need to become before extra fuel felt justified? This is where medieval winter becomes more revealing than picturesque. The problem was not simply that people lacked technology. The problem was that heat required resources, and resources were uneven, local, and often scarce at exactly the time of year when the need was greatest. A cold season that lasted longer than expected was not just unpleasant. It could disrupt the entire household economy. More fuel used meant more labor spent gathering it, more money spent buying it, or more risk taken in stretching supplies too far. Clothing helped, of course, but even here modern assumptions can mislead us. Medieval Europeans were not walking helplessly into winter in thin rags unless they were very poor indeed. Wool was crucial, and for good reason. It insulated well even when somewhat damp, and layered garments could make an enormous difference. Cloaks, hoods, stockings, caps, mantles, lined garments, and blankets all mattered. But warmth through clothing depended on quality, quantity, and condition. A well-made woolen layer was valuable. For linings, thicker fabrics, and multiple changes of clothing were markers of wealth. Poorer people often made do with less, or with garments worn thin through long use. If your shoes leaked, if your cloak was patched and losing loft, if your bedding was damp, then winter was no longer an abstract season. It was something your body negotiated hour by hour. Sleeping may have been one of the hardest parts. During the day, there was movement, work, and proximity to the fire. At night, all of that narrowed. Medieval beds were often smaller, more enclosed, and more heavily layered than ours, not because people had strange tastes, but because they understood the value of trapping heat. Curtains around beds, shared sleeping arrangements, wool blankets, fur covers, and even sleeping caps all served a practical purpose. Body heat mattered. Privacy was often a luxury, but in winter so was sleeping alone. To a modern mind, the crowded arrangements of medieval households can seem inconvenient or oppressive. In cold weather, they could also be protective. Even then, the bed itself might still be cold, especially in unheated chambers. Wealthier households sometimes used warming pans, heated objects passed between linens before sleep, though these came with obvious limitations and risks. Most people simply climbed into cold bedding and waited for their own warmth to gather beneath the covers. That is a small detail, but it reveals something larger. Warmth in the medieval world was often something you generated, guarded, and shared, rather than something the building provided for you automatically. Food was another hidden part of the story. Staying warm was not only about external heat. It was also about metabolism, labor, and nourishment. A body working through winter needed fuel of its own. Bread, pottage, ale, cheese, salted meat when available, preserved fish, beans, oats, cabbage, onions, and whatever local stores remained all played a role. Medieval people did not talk about calories the way we do, but they understood from experience that certain foods strengthened the body against cold and labor. Hunger and cold were close companions. A poorly fed household felt winter more sharply than a better supplied one. This is also why winter could carry such a psychological weight. It was a season of shorter light, muddier roads, reduced mobility, and tighter margins. Wetness was often as miserable as cold itself. A freezing clear day could be hard, but damp cold penetrated differently. It clung to clothing, entered bedding, softened leather, spoiled stored fuel, and made the labor of ordinary survival feel slower and heavier. In many parts of Europe, the problem was not dramatic snow every day, but recurring chill, mud, wind, and moisture combined with imperfect shelter. That combination could wear people down far more quietly than the popular image of a grand snowbound winter might suggest. And yet medieval Europeans were not passive sufferers in the face of all this. They adapted constantly. Houses were improved where means allowed. Better chimneys spread. Textiles became more specialized. Urban trades made and sold garments suited to cold weather. Monasteries, castles, and prosperous homes developed more complex internal arrangements, with private chambers and better heat control than earlier generations had known. But progress was uneven, and it did not erase the central truth. Warmth remained expensive, localized, and deeply tied to labor. There is also a strange irony here. The more impressive a building looked to us from the outside, the less comfortable it could sometimes be in winter. Vast halls, high ceilings, and stone surfaces expressed authority, but they also created distance between fire and flesh. Grandeur did not always mean comfort. In fact, one of the hidden privileges of later centuries would be not simply richer decoration, but improved control over interior climate. Medieval people of rank could possess enormous spaces and still retreat miserably to the warmest corner they could find. The church shaped winter life too, though not always in the way modern viewers expect. Parish churches and great cathedrals were visually overwhelming, but they could be intensely cold places. Worshippers stood or knelt through services in spaces that were spiritually elevating and physically uncomfortable. Stone, height, and limited heating created an atmosphere that was solemn in more ways than one. Religious calendars also structured winter routines through feast days, fasting periods, and communal expectations, offering moments of relief, charity, or gathering, but not freedom from the season itself. Medieval Christianity gave meaning to suffering, endurance, charity, and preparation, and in winter those ideas were not abstract. What modern people often misunderstand is that medieval discomfort was rarely experienced as a single isolated inconvenience. Cold connected to architecture, class, food supply, family structure, clothing, labor, and timekeeping. If your hands were cold, that affected spinning, mending, carving, writing, cooking, and prayer. If your house was smoky, that affected sleep and breathing. If the roads turned poor, fuel and goods became harder to move. If livestock weakened, the household economy weakened with them. A cold room was never just a cold room. It was part of a larger chain of pressures. That may be the deepest reason staying warm was so difficult. Not because medieval people failed to understand winter, and not because they were somehow indifferent to comfort, but because they lived in a world where comfort competed with necessity at every level. Heat cost something. Better walls cost something. More blankets cost something. Extra food cost something. And for most people, there was never enough of everything to make winter easy. So when we imagine medieval Europe by candlelight, with a fire glowing softly in a timber hall, it is worth holding onto the less decorative truth beneath the image. The warmth was real but fragile. It had to be fed. It had to be protected. It rarely reached every corner. And outside that circle of firelight, the season was still waiting, pressed against shutters, settled into stone, moving patiently through the long night toward morning. And morning, in much of medieval Europe, began before the house had fully recovered from the night. The fire that had looked almost comforting in the evening was often reduced by dawn to embers, ash, and a few stubborn pockets of heat hidden under gray powder. Someone had to stir it, coax it, feed it, and hope that yesterday's care had been enough to make today's beginning easier. If the hearth had gone fully cold, the first task of the day became more difficult at once. Hands stiffened. Water felt sharper. Clothes that had seemed merely cool the night before now carried the full chill of the room. In winter, getting up was not a small act of inconvenience. It was a physical decision to leave behind the limited warmth the bed had gathered and step back into a house that had, in many cases, cooled almost as completely as the world outside. That moment helps explain why medieval winter life was structured so strongly around routine. People did not simply wake and choose comfort or discomfort as separate options. They woke into obligations that had to be met regardless of temperature. Fires had to be revived. Water had to be fetched. Animals had to be checked. Dough had to be prepared, tools handled, clothes put on, fuel measured, shutters opened or adjusted, and some sort of meal begun before longer labor could start. Cold entered all of these small actions. It slowed fingers, made washing less appealing, made dressing more cumbersome, and turned every morning task into part of the larger work of survival. For women managing households, servants tending chambers, and laborers preparing for the day, warmth was not an abstract domestic condition but a sequence of small victories that had to be remade. It is tempting to imagine heat as something either present or absent. In truth, it was more unstable than that. A kitchen might feel almost bearable when the fire was active, then lose much of its comfort as soon as fuel was reduced or a door remained open too long. A sleeping area might hold trapped warmth under blankets, yet feel hostile the moment someone rose to dress. A hall might become livelier and marginally warmer once bodies, food, and fire gathered together, but only at its center. Medieval warmth was shifting, local, and fragile. It followed effort. This is one reason why the division of space inside buildings mattered more than it may first appear. In poorer homes, there were fewer rooms and fewer choices. Much of life took place around the hearth because that was where the least miserable conditions existed. In wealthier settings, however, architecture gradually offered more selective comfort. Private chambers, upper rooms, wall hangings, screens, wooden paneling, better-fitted shutters, and smaller heated spaces all helped create pockets of protection. Yet even here, the goal was often not abundance of warmth but concentration of it. People learned, very practically, not how to heat an entire building in the modern sense, but how to make a few key spaces tolerable. That distinction becomes especially important in castles. Modern imagination tends to see the castle as powerful, secure, and therefore somehow protected from weather. In military terms it might be. In domestic terms, winter often revealed its weaknesses. Great halls were impressive settings for ceremony, hospitality, and display, but not necessarily for prolonged physical ease. Large volumes of air were difficult to warm. High roofs drew smoke upward but also let heat disperse. Stone surfaces remained cold to the touch, cold to lean against, cold simply to live beside. Nobles did what they could with tapestries, furs, braziers, enclosed beds, and withdrawal into smaller chambers. But there was no simple transformation by which a fortress became cozy. Grandeur and comfort still pulled in different directions. That is another quiet reversal hidden inside the topic. The very features that symbolized medieval status could work against bodily ease. A peasant cottage might be smoky, cramped, and uncomfortable in 100 ways, but a smaller structure with animals nearby and people close together could sometimes hold heat more effectively than a great noble residence built to impress. This did not make peasant life easier, of course. The labor, vulnerability, and poor materials remained severe. But it reminds us that staying warm was not a simple ladder where every step upward meant better winter experience. Wealth improved options, but architecture, custom, and prestige could complicate the result. Windows provide another example of this. In many ordinary homes, openings were small for good reason. Glass was expensive and not universally available. Shutters, oiled cloth, parchment, wooden covers, and other local solutions helped reduce exposure, but none created the bright sealed interiors modern viewers expect. Light and warmth were often in tension. To admit daylight was to risk admitting cold. To close against wind was to darken the room. In richer urban settings and ecclesiastical buildings, glazed windows existed, But even there they did not function as modern insulated barriers. Medieval winter interiors were frequently dim not by accident alone, but because practical thermal choices kept them that way. The body adapted as well, though adaptation should not be mistaken for ease. People wore caps indoors because the head lost heat. They layered linen and wool not as quaint costume but as a daily necessity. They valued dry clothing intensely because dampness stole warmth more effectively than mere cold air. They moved when they could, huddled when needed, and learned from long experience how to sit, sleep, store, and work in relation to the fire. Medieval people understood cold intimately. They knew where it entered the body first, how it settled into extremities, how it changed mood and pace, how a draft could undo the comfort of a whole room. This practical knowledge rarely appears in grand historical summaries, but it shaped daily life as surely as law or religion. Children, the elderly, and the sick lived at the hardest edge of this reality. A healthy adult engaged in regular labor could at least produce some heat through movement and food, assuming enough food was available. But those with weaker bodies or less mobility had fewer defenses. A child in winter depended not only on clothing and blankets, but on adults maintaining fires, storing supplies, and making sensible judgments. An elderly person might feel cold more deeply and recover more slowly from it. The ill, especially those confined indoors, faced a cruel contradiction. They needed warmth, but warmth cost fuel, labor, and attention that the household might already be struggling to spare. Medical ideas of the time also affected how people understood and managed cold. Medieval learned medicine, shaped by humoral theory, treated heat and cold not merely as sensations but as qualities that influenced bodily balance. Certain foods, drinks, medicines, and regimens were thought to warm the body or counter harmful coldness. While modern physiology would frame the matter differently, it would be a mistake to dismiss these efforts as nonsense. People were working from a coherent worldview that linked environment, diet, age, temperament, and illness. Warm broths, spiced wine for those who could afford it, heated coverings, and carefully managed rest all reflected attempts to restore balance in bodies thought vulnerable to winter's effects. Monasteries faced their own version of the problem. Religious houses are sometimes imagined as orderly refuges, and in some respects they were. They possessed routines, communal resources, and more institutional continuity than many lay households. But monastic buildings were also disciplined spaces, often large, stone-built, and not intended primarily for physical comfort. Rules in some orders placed limits on heating, clothing, and bodily indulgence. The tension between spiritual discipline and practical necessity could become especially noticeable in cold weather. Monks and nuns prayed, studied, and worked in environments where the temperature was not incidental but ever present, shaping posture, endurance, and even concentration. Urban life introduced another variation. Medieval towns were not immune to cold simply because they were crowded. Houses stood closer together and sometimes benefited from shared walls, which could slightly reduce exposure. Markets allowed access to fuel and warm foods if one had money. Tradesmen worked with heat in bakeries, kitchens, brewhouses, workshops, and forges. But cities also brought smoke, damp lanes, poor drainage, and stark inequality. The winter experience of a prosperous merchant family in a well-appointed house was not the winter experience of a laborer, widow, apprentice, or beggar. Towns concentrated people, and with them concentrated both resources and misery. In a harsh season, the street itself could become a measure of who had protection and who did not. Fuel remained at the center of all this, and fuel was never just a household matter. It was environmental, economic, and political. Woodland management mattered. Rights of access mattered. Transport mattered. Lords could regulate usage. Town authorities might concern themselves with supply. As populations grew in certain regions and pressure on woodland increased, obtaining affordable fuel could become harder. The ordinary act of burning something to stay alive connected households to the wider management of land. That is one reason the history of warmth is more revealing than it first appears. It ties domestic life to larger systems with unusual clarity. And once fuel was inside the house, there were still trade-offs. A larger fire consumed precious reserves faster. Green wood smoked more. Poorly stored wood burned badly. Peat gave heat, but with its own smell and qualities. Charcoal was useful but costly in many contexts. Straw and brush flared quickly and vanished quickly. Every choice had consequences in labor, cost, smoke, or duration. Medieval people did not simply lack better answers. They lived among constrained options and made constant calculations within them. Even the pleasures of winter, when they existed, were shaped by this background of effort. A feast held in a hall lit by fire and candles could feel rich, protective, and festive precisely because warmth was not taken for granted. Thick stew, fresh bread, mulled drink, roasted meat, and company close to the hearth carried emotional force because they stood against the season outside. Hospitality itself had thermal meaning. To offer someone a seat near the fire was not only courtesy. It was a tangible relocation within the hierarchy of comfort. To be kept at the edge of the room was to feel the order of the household in your bones. The emotional texture of winter should not be overlooked either. Cold changes time. It makes mornings feel slower, distances longer, and evenings heavier. In medieval Europe, where artificial light was limited and labor still depended strongly on season and daylight, winter could tighten the psychological boundaries of life. People gathered closer, traveled less when roads worsened, and inhabited a narrower world of repeated indoor routines. Smoke, animal sounds, prayer, mending, storage, and waiting. This could create intimacy but also fatigue. Long winters tested patience as much as flesh. And then there was wetness, which may have been as hated as cold itself. A dry cold could be endured differently than the persistent damp of many European winters. Moisture crept into walls, rushes, clothing, bedding, and shoes. Leather stiffened and then softened and then rotted. Wool retained warmth better than many materials, but even wool had its limits when repeatedly soaked and slowly dried in smoky rooms. The medieval battle for warmth was, in many places, really a battle against chill combined with dampness. A person could sit near a fire and still not feel fully warm if the deeper problem was wet cloth, wet air, and a house slowly giving the cold back. That may be why so many strategies aimed not only at producing heat, but at keeping materials dry. Firewood had to be sheltered. Bedding had to be aired when possible. Clothing had to be repaired, shaken out, dried, and preserved. Floors might be strewn with fresh rushes, though that came with other hygiene problems over time. Chests, benches, hooks, loft spaces, and rafters were all part of the household's ongoing attempt to manage limited warmth in a damp climate. Domestic order was, in part, thermal order. If one follows the day further, toward evening again, another pattern emerges. Much of medieval life in winter bent toward reconcentration. Work that had spread outward in daylight pulled inward toward the hearth. Supper, mending, story, prayer, and preparation for sleep all returned to that central space where fuel, food, and bodies combined. Yet this was not a return to ease so much as a return to the least difficult part of the day. Night still carried risks. Fires had to be managed carefully. Too much flame invited disaster in timber buildings. Too little left the house bitter by dawn. The balance was never entirely relaxed. And this is where the subject begins to reveal something deeper about medieval society as a whole. To To stay warm was to depend on a chain of materials and relationships. On forests and fields, on sheep and cloth makers, on household labor, on architecture, on servants or kin, on legal access, on stored food, on weather patterns, on the design of beds, on the timing of chores, and on the simple luck of whether a season turned ordinary or cruel. Warmth was never merely about comfort. It was about whether a household's whole system held together under pressure. In years of harsher winter, that pressure could become more than domestic. It could begin to bend local economies, strain charity, expose the limits of authority, and turn the ordinary problem of keeping a room warm into the first visible sign of something larger beginning to fail. Most years, people in medieval Europe expected hardship as part of the calendar. They planned for it in ordinary ways. Salted meat stored in barrels, grain measured carefully, firewood stacked and watched, roofs checked, cloaks repaired, candles rationed, and animals prepared for colder months. Winter was not a surprise. It was a known opponent. But occasionally, the season arrived with a severity that exceeded custom, and then the familiar balance between discomfort and survival began to shift. A long freeze, an early frost, repeated storms, failed autumn harvests, or blocked roads could turn the normal challenge of warmth into something more dangerous. Food stores that were meant to last until spring began to thin too quickly. Firewood vanished faster than expected. Livestock weakened. Markets became unreliable. Travel slowed or stopped. The household calculations that usually held a family together became unstable, and once that happened, warmth could no longer be separated from hunger, debt, and fear. This is one of the reasons medieval chronicles remember winter so vividly. Writers often recorded great frosts, severe snows, rivers freezing, or years when the cold seemed to alter the entire rhythm of life. Not every report should be read literally. Medieval chroniclers could write dramatically, and memory tends to preserve extremes. But the emotional truth behind these records is clear. A truly harsh winter was socially visible. It interrupted ordinary expectations so strongly that people marked it as a historical event rather than just weather. When rivers froze, it changed more than the landscape. Rivers were roads, trade routes, sources of water, and economic lifelines. A frozen river might allow unusual travel across its surface, but it could also halt transport systems people depended on. Mills could be affected. Fishing changed. Supply chains narrowed. In towns already managing limited fuel and food, that mattered quickly. The romantic image of a frozen medieval river, children, perhaps, or merchants crossing ice, sits beside a harsher truth. Frozen water often meant disrupted survival. Snow carried a similar double meaning. Fresh snow could be beautiful, and in some places useful, but deep or repeated snowfall isolated villages, burdened roofs, trapped livestock, and made movement painfully slow. Roads that were already difficult in wet seasons became nearly useless. Medical help, religious obligations, trade, and simple communication all became harder. Medieval life depended heavily on movement at a local scale. Walking, carting, carrying, checking boundaries, reaching neighbors, and snow interrupted that in practical ways. For peasants, especially, winter pressure was tied to animals. Livestock were not background scenery. They were savings, labor, food, manure, transport, and future security. Keeping animals alive through winter required fodder, shelter, and labor at the very moment human households were also tightening their own supplies. A weak winter for cattle, sheep, pigs, or horses could echo long after the thaw. Losing an animal was not merely emotional or inconvenient. It could reshape the entire next year. This is another reason why medieval homes were sometimes shared with animals or built with their needs physically close to human life. To a modern viewer, the arrangement may seem dirty or uncomfortable, and often it was both. But proximity also meant protection. Animals generated warmth. They needed guarding. Their survival and the household's survival were linked too closely to separate neatly. The winter house was a practical compromise, not a failure of taste. In monasteries and manorial estates, winter management became an administrative problem. Grain stores had to be protected and distributed. Fuel had to be allocated. Servants and dependents expected provision. Charity toward the poor, especially around religious obligations, could become more pressing precisely when resources were most strained. A lord's reputation was not untouched by how winter scarcity was handled. Authority, in part, meant being seen to maintain order when the season threatened disorder. That point matters because medieval warmth was never purely private. It existed inside networks of obligation. Tenants expected certain protections. Villagers watched one another's fortunes closely. Monasteries served not only spiritual roles but practical ones. Parish communities knew who was struggling. Winter sharpened visibility. Someone without enough fuel could not hide it for long. Someone selling possessions too early in the season was making a public announcement of risk. Cold revealed weakness before spring confirmed it. And then there were the urban poor whose experience could be especially precarious. A peasant might at least have direct access to woodlands, animals, or a small household economy, however fragile. A poor laborer in a town might depend almost entirely on wages, purchased fuel, and rented shelter. If work slowed, if illness struck, or if prices rose sharply, warmth became immediately uncertain. Medieval charity was real. Parishes, guilds, hospitals, monasteries, and wealthy households all played roles. But charity was uneven, moralized, and never enough to erase structural vulnerability. The smell of winter cities must have been distinctive. Smoke from countless fires hung low in cold air. Wet streets, refuse, animals, leather, brewing, baking, and human proximity created a dense atmosphere modern people would notice instantly. Yet even here warmth shaped status. Bakers worked beside ovens, smiths beside forges, kitchen servants near hearths. Porters and beggars remained outside. Occupation itself determined who felt winter in the fingers and who felt it in the lungs. Even clothing law reflected this hierarchy. In some regions and periods, sumptuary laws attempted to regulate what different classes could wear. Fabrics, furs, colors, decorative features. These laws were about status and social order, but winter made them physically meaningful. Fine fur linings were not merely decorative luxuries. They changed experience. A lined mantle, quality boots, gloves, heavier cloaks. These were signs of rank, yes, but also barriers against suffering. The body understood class even before the eye did. Fur deserves a brief pause here, because it often appears in medieval imagery as a symbol of wealth and elegance, which it certainly was. But it was also intensely practical. Squirrel, rabbit, fox, lamb, marten, and other furs appeared in different contexts depending on means and region. Lining a garment with fur altered daily life. It turned wind from punishment into inconvenience. It extended the tolerable length of travel. It made prayer in a cold chapel less punishing, night watch less brutal, and illness slightly less dangerous. Luxury and survival were not always separate categories. Travel itself became a test of winter's seriousness. Roads in medieval Europe were already inconsistent. Mud, ruts, poor bridges, local hazards, and seasonal damage made movement slow in the best conditions. Winter added ice, flooding, shortened daylight, and the threat of exposure. A journey that sounded ordinary in summer could become genuinely dangerous in January. Merchants, messengers, pilgrims, officials, and soldiers all had to calculate risk differently. Travel delayed by weather was not a minor inconvenience but a rearrangement of politics, trade, and personal lives. This helps explain why winter hospitality carried such importance in literature and memory. The offer of shelter, fire, and food was morally significant because it met a real physical danger. Inns, monasteries, noble households, and village homes all participated in this culture differently, but the principle remained. To refuse warmth to someone exposed to winter was not socially neutral. It touched questions of duty, charity, reputation, and faith. At the same time, fire itself remained dangerous. The very thing people depended on most for survival could destroy the fragile wooden world around them. Medieval towns feared fire for good reason. Hearths, candles, kitchens, workshops, braziers, and winter desperation all increased risk. A family trying to stay warm at night might also be trying not to burn down everything they owned. Fires spread quickly through timber structures, thatched roofs, and tightly packed streets. So warmth required caution. Too little flame brought suffering. Too much invited catastrophe. That balance shaped domestic behavior. Fires were banked carefully. Candles were expensive and used with awareness. Cooking and heating were not casually separated. Children learned the habits of caution young. Night especially required judgment. Let the room grow too cold and dawn would be miserable. Keep too much open flame and sleep itself became dangerous. Medieval comfort was always negotiated with risk. There is also a subtler emotional contradiction here. Winter encouraged closeness, but closeness was not always peaceful. Shared beds, crowded rooms, animals nearby, limited privacy, constant smoke, and economic strain created intimacy, but also friction. The romantic vision of everyone gathered warmly around the hearth ignores the exhaustion of repeated proximity. Arguments had less room to disappear. Illness spread easily. Grief stayed visible. A house in winter held people together, but not always gently. Children born into this world did not think of it as strange. They learned the geography of warmth instinctively, where the fire reached, where frost appeared first, which door let in the draft, which wall stayed damp, which blanket was thickest, which task should be done before hands grew too cold. This knowledge was ordinary and therefore rarely written down. Yet it formed part of the education of daily life as surely as prayer or farming. Even language reflected this closeness to season. Saints' days, planting times, feast days, and local memory often organized time more vividly than numbered months. Winter was felt through repeated physical markers. The first frost on the trough, the way breath looked in morning light, the sound of frozen ground under shoes, the difficulty of washing, the shortening of light near prayer time, the smell of damp while drying too slowly near the hearth. People did not need a forecast to know what season meant. Their house told them, and still not all winters were equal. Climate varied across Europe enormously. A winter in northern England was not the same as one in southern Italy, and alpine life differed again from coastal towns or river valleys. Local architecture, available fuel, clothing traditions, and food systems all changed the experience. That matters because medieval Europe is not a single weather pattern. Yet across these differences, the same principle repeated: warmth had to be made, not assumed. There is a tendency in modern imagination to divide the past into either misery or romance. Medieval winter resists both. People were not endlessly suffering in frozen darkness, nor were they living inside picturesque holiday scenes. They were managing. They were adapting. They were making hard practical decisions with imperfect tools and strong habits. They found comfort where they could and endured what they could not change. In many ways, that realism is more interesting than either myth. And perhaps the most revealing part is this: when spring finally arrived, warmth itself could feel like an event of almost moral importance. Dry ground, longer light, easier movement, surviving animals, reduced fuel anxiety. less smoke trapped indoors, the possibility of washing without dread. These were not small seasonal pleasures. They were the visible return of margin, of breath, of a world expanding again. Which means that winter was not only a season of cold, but a season that taught people exactly what warmth was worth. Not luxury, not decoration, not background comfort, something closer to stability itself. And in the centuries that followed, as chimneys improved, domestic architecture changed, textile production expanded, and ideas of private comfort slowly shifted, Europe's relationship with warmth began to change too, but not all at once and not for everyone. The old habits lingered, and for a very long time, even in houses that looked more refined from the outside, the same ancient problem remained waiting beside the hearth: how to keep enough heat alive to last through one more night. When historians talk about the Middle Ages, attention often falls on kings, wars, cathedrals, crusades, and plague. Yet, for the average household, the slow transformation of domestic warmth could be just as meaningful. A better chimney, a more enclosed sleeping space, thicker glazing, improved cloth production, a more reliable access to fuel. These were not dramatic events, but they changed the body's experience of life. They altered how people slept, how they recovered from illness, how old age felt, how children survived winter, and how much of daily labor had to be spent simply defending against cold. One of the most important changes was the spread and improvement of the chimney. Early medieval homes, especially simpler ones, often relied on central hearths where smoke drifted upward and escaped through roof openings or imperfect vents. This arrangement was functional, but only to a point. Smoke-blackened rafters, irritated lungs, watery eyes, and soot-covered interiors were common companions to warmth. A fire could cook food and offer heat, but it also filled the house with a constant low-level discomfort modern people would find difficult to tolerate for long. The chimney did not instantly solve this, nor did it appear everywhere at once. Its spread was gradual, uneven, and closely tied to wealth, region, and building style. But where it became common, it changed domestic life profoundly. Smoke could be directed upward more efficiently. Rooms could be organized differently. Upper floors became more practical. Private chambers could be heated in new ways. Walls stayed cleaner. Breathing improved at least somewhat. And perhaps most importantly, the fire became easier to live beside. This may sound like a small technical detail, but it altered social life. The hearth had always gathered people because it was necessary. With improved chimney design, warmth could be made more stable and less hostile. Conversation, sewing, reading, prayer, and quiet evening work could happen in spaces that were not constantly fighting smoke. Domestic comfort did not arrive suddenly, but the shape of indoor life began to shift. In noble households, this change helped encourage the move away from the single dominant great hall toward more specialized private rooms. The great hall remained symbolically important, still the place for hospitality, ceremony, and visible power, but lords and ladies increasingly withdrew to chambers that offered privacy and better heat control. This was not only about status or personal preference. It was about winter reality. A smaller room with tapestries, shutters, a hearth, and a bed enclosed by curtains could offer a level of comfort impossible in the center of a vast stone hall. The bed itself became part of this architecture of warmth. Modern people often see medieval beds in manuscripts or reconstructed rooms and notice the heavy curtains first. They can look theatrical, even excessive. In truth, they were often deeply practical. Bed curtains trapped heat, blocked drafts, and created a warmer microclimate inside a cold room. Sleeping in an enclosed bed was not merely decorative privacy. It was thermal strategy. Thick blankets, wool mattresses stuffed with straw or feathers depending on wealth, fur coverings, bolsters, and sleeping caps all worked together toward the same goal. Even servants, when possible, understood the value of proximity and enclosure. Shared sleeping spaces were common not only because privacy was limited, but because warmth was social. Bodies warmed rooms. Rooms warmed bodies. Sleeping alone in a large cold chamber could be far less comfortable than sharing a smaller crowded one. Again, what looks strange to us often made complete practical sense inside the system. Glass, too, changed expectations slowly. For much of the medieval period, proper glazed windows were expensive and largely associated with wealth, religious buildings, and urban prosperity. Ordinary homes relied on shutters, cloth, parchment, horn, or simply small openings managed carefully. But where glass became more common, it changed winter life in subtle but meaningful ways. It allowed more light without the same degree of exposure. It reduced drafts. It made rooms feel less divided between darkness and cold. It did not create modern comfort. Medieval glass was imperfect, expensive, and far from airtight, but it represented another step toward controlling the indoor environment rather than merely enduring it. Textiles mattered just as much as architecture. The medieval world was built in wool. Wool-clothed bodies, lined beds, hung from walls, covered benches, wrapped infants, protected travelers, and softened stone interiors. A tapestry was not only visual display. It insulated walls. Curtains were not only privacy. They interrupted drafts. Carpets and rushes underfoot were not merely decorative. They changed how cold moved upward through the body. This is why textile production was economically and socially central. Sheep, spinning, weaving, dyeing, fulling, tailoring, these were not secondary industries supporting fashion. They were part of how society physically survived. A well-made cloak could mean safer travel. A thicker blanket could mean a child surviving illness more easily. A lined hood changed winter labor. Cloth was infrastructure, and because it mattered so much, it also revealed inequality immediately. The difference between coarse worn wool and well-finished broadcloth was not simply visual. It was tactile, bodily, and daily. A noble wrapped in lined garments moved through the same winter as a peasant, but not through the same physical reality. Class, once again, was felt first through the skin. There is another shift worth noticing here. Privacy itself, as an ideal, grew partly alongside changing thermal possibilities. In a world where warmth depended on shared space, privacy could be expensive. To sleep separately, to study alone, to retreat from the household required enough resources to heat smaller spaces effectively. As architecture improved and elite households developed more chambers, privacy became not just socially desirable but physically possible. Silence, solitude, and warmth began to align more easily. This seems obvious to modern people, but in much of medieval life it was not. The intimate connection between comfort and shared survival shaped social expectations far more strongly than individual preference. Even castles, slowly and imperfectly, adapted. More fireplaces appeared. Chambers became more specialized. Latrines, stairways, service rooms, and private apartments were arranged with greater domestic realism rather than pure symbolic display. A late medieval castle might still be cold by modern standards, but it often reflected a clearer understanding that power had to be lived in, not merely admired from a distance. The church changed more slowly. Great cathedrals remained cold because their purpose was never bodily comfort. They were spaces of awe, scale, and spiritual orientation. But smaller parish churches, monasteries, and clerical residences still negotiated winter practically. Choir stalls, cloisters, refectories, and infirmaries all required decisions about fuel and warmth. Monastic infirmaries, especially, reveal the practical tension between spiritual discipline and human fragility. Even the strictest rule could bend when illness and winter combined. Hospitals of the medieval world, very different from modern hospitals, often religious institutions focused on care, shelter, and charity, faced the same challenge. The poor, travelers, the elderly, and the sick required warmth not as luxury but as treatment. Firewood, blankets, and enclosed beds were forms of medicine. Charity in winter was often thermal before it was philosophical. This becomes especially clear during epidemics and famine years. When illness spread, warmth and food became inseparable from recovery. A fever in a cold room was a different kind of danger. A weakened body in damp bedding carried greater risk. Medieval medicine could not control infection in modern terms, but people still understood from experience that shelter, nourishment, and warmth mattered. Sometimes the most meaningful treatment was not a rare herb or physician's theory, but dry sheets and enough fuel to keep a room from turning hostile. Winter also shaped labor patterns more than many modern viewers realize. Not all work stopped, of course. Animals still needed tending, tools needed repair, food preparation continued, and many urban trades remained active. But certain rhythms changed. Agricultural labor narrowed. More indoor tasks took prominence. Mending, spinning, maintenance, planning, storage, accounting. Winter was often a season of repair and preparation as much as survival. This changed the emotional character of time. Summer pushed outward toward fields, roads, and movement. Winter pulled inward toward repetition and management. Long evenings created space for oral storytelling, household instruction, prayer, and memory. Much of what we imagine as traditional medieval domestic culture. Stories by firelight, seasonal rituals, inherited household knowledge, was shaped by these compressed winter hours when people were forced closer together. And still, warmth remained uncertain enough that people noticed its absence almost more clearly than its presence. Complaints in letters, household accounts noting unusual fuel costs, legal disputes over woodland access, monastery records tracking stores, estate management instructions, and simple chroniclers' remarks about bitter seasons all remind us that cold was not background scenery. It was administratively visible. It entered writing because it entered budgets. It entered sermons because it entered morality. It entered memory because it entered the body. There is a quiet honesty in that. We often think history belongs to exceptional moments, but much of it belongs to repeated discomforts people had to solve again and again. Staying warm was one of those. It rarely produced monuments, yet it shaped the design of homes, the distribution of wealth, the rhythm of labor, and the expectations of family life. And if we look carefully, it also shaped ideas of civilization itself. A well-ordered household was often described through signs of managed warmth. Food ready, fire maintained, servants organized, guests received properly, children clothed, old people protected, stores intact. Disorder looked cold. Neglect smelled of dampness and smoke gone wrong. Hospitality was measured partly in heat offered to others. Domestic competence was, in many ways, the art of keeping winter from becoming visible too quickly. That may be why winter scenes in medieval literature carry such emotional weight. A traveler reaching firelight, a lord welcoming guests into a hall, a saint enduring exposure, a widow lacking fuel, a feast after snow. These images mattered because they touched something universal and immediate. They were never only symbolic. They were recognizable truths. And then, across the late medieval centuries, another force complicated all of this. Towns grew larger, trade widened, and the market itself began to mediate warmth more aggressively. People were increasingly not just gathering fuel from local custom, but buying it, competing for it, transporting it, regulating it. Heat became even more visibly economic. In some places, with scarcity intensified, forests were pressured by shipbuilding, construction, metalworking, and population growth. Urban demand strained nearby supplies. Prices shifted. Households adapted by changing fuel sources where possible by stricter rationing, or by accepting lower standards of comfort than they would have preferred. The problem did not disappear with progress. In some ways, it became sharper because expectation and dependency both grew. And so the medieval story of warmth moves forward not toward a neat invention that solved everything, but toward a more complicated world where comfort, privacy, status, fuel, and architecture became increasingly tangled together. A fire in the hearth still mattered, but now it existed inside changing economies and changing ideas of what a home ought to feel like. By the late Middle Ages, some people were beginning to imagine indoor life differently, not merely as shelter from weather, but as a space that should be intentionally shaped for comfort. That idea sounds ordinary now. At the time, it was quietly revolutionary, and it would change far more than winter. This change was slow enough that no one living through it would have described it as a revolution. It arrived through habits, purchases, repairs, and expectations rather than declarations. A merchant family deciding to glaze an additional window. A noble household investing in better wall hangings for a chamber used through winter. A town resident choosing to spend scarce money on a sturdier bedstead, thicker blankets, or a better-fitted shutter. These were not grand events. Yet together they marked a shift in how people thought about daily life. Comfort was becoming something worth planning for, not merely a lucky byproduct of survival. That mattered because medieval life had long been organized around endurance. One expected cold, smoke, dampness, inconvenience, and shared discomfort as ordinary conditions. To seek relief was sensible, but to expect consistent ease was rare outside the highest ranks. As domestic expectations changed, however, the idea of what counted as a properly ordered household changed with them. A warm room became not just a pleasant accident, but a sign of competence, prosperity, and care. This is especially visible in urban households during the later Middle Ages. Towns created a different relationship with winter because they encouraged comparison. In a village, local standards were often shared and visible. In a town, neighbors lived close enough to notice details: whose chimney smoked well, whose shutters fit properly, whose household servants carried in enough fuel, whose children wore good winter clothing, whose rooms were well furnished for receiving guests. Comfort became socially legible. Warmth itself could signal respectability. Merchants and prosperous artisans, especially, occupied an interesting position here. They were not noble, but they increasingly had the means to shape domestic life with intention. Their houses often reflected a careful balance between practicality and display. A front room for business and receiving, upper chambers for family life, better storage, improved beds, more textiles, and closed fireplaces. These were not luxuries in the courtly sense, but they represented a growing belief that the household should protect dignity as well as survival. In colder months, that dignity was tested constantly. Could guests be received without embarrassment? Could children be kept healthy? Could older relatives remain comfortable? Could illness be managed without the house collapsing into disorder? Warmth sat quietly beneath all of these questions. This also changed women's domestic authority in subtle ways. Medieval household management was never simple or uniform, and class shaped everything. But in many contexts, the practical supervision of food, linen, clothing, servants, bedding, storage, and winter preparation gave women enormous influence over whether a home functioned well. To manage warmth was not a decorative responsibility. It meant preserving the household itself. The timing of washing, the repair of wool garments, the protection of blankets from damp, the handling of fuel, the arrangement of sleeping spaces, the care of the sick, all of this shaped how winter was experienced. A well-run winter household was often invisible precisely because disaster had been prevented. This is one of the least glamorous but most important truths of medieval domestic life. History often records kings because they failed loudly. It rarely records the woman who ensured enough dry linen existed during a freezing illness, or the servant who protected fuel stores from ruin, or the elderly relative who knew exactly when winter stores were being used too quickly. Yet these forms of knowledge kept people alive. Servants, too, experienced warmth through hierarchy. In great houses, the difference between master and servant was often measured not only in authority but in temperature. Kitchens could be hot from labor but exhausting. Servants' sleeping quarters might be cramped, drafty, or placed near work rather than comfort. The lord and lady withdrew to enclosed chambers with better beds and heavier curtains. The household literally arranged warmth according to rank. This makes hospitality even more revealing. To invite a guest closer to the fire was not symbolic politeness alone. It was a transfer of privilege. Seating order in halls mattered because heat was part of status. The person nearest the hearth occupied a better social position than the one at the colder edge of the room. Medieval hierarchy could be read through architecture and felt through the skin. Even law touched this world. Disputes over firewood, woodland access, grazing rights, and common land were not abstract property arguments. They were arguments about winter survival. A peasant's right to gather fallen wood could determine whether a family endured February safely. Restrictions imposed by lords or changing economic pressures could turn old customs into sources of resentment. Forest law, often remembered mainly through stories of royal hunting rights, also mattered at the level of ordinary warmth. In some regions, access to common resources became one of the hidden battlegrounds of winter life. A forest was timber, yes, but it was also tomorrow's fire. Lords might see management. Villagers might see necessity. Conflict between those views could be sharp because the stakes were physical and immediate. The same was true of taxation and rent. A bad harvest followed by a hard winter made every obligation heavier. Grain paid away was grain not eaten. Money spent on dues was money not spent on fuel. Medieval peasants understood power partly through winter arithmetic. If obligations remained rigid while weather turned cruel, authority itself could begin to feel cold. This is why famine and winter are so often remembered together. Hunger was rarely a single failed meal. It was the slow tightening of options. Less bread, thinner pottage, more caution with ale, livestock sold too early, fuel reduced to preserve food, or food reduced to preserve fuel. Bodies losing resilience before spring arrived. Cold and hunger amplified each other because both demanded energy from the same limited household reserves. Children felt this especially sharply. Winter childhood was not only about festive memory or snow, but about shorter days, heavier clothing, less movement, and dependence on adults making the right decisions. Infants were vulnerable to cold in obvious ways. Older children learned work through winter tasks, carrying fuel, helping with animals, assisting with mending, watching fires, sharing beds, learning household caution. Their education in survival was practical and immediate. Old age carried another version of the same challenge. The elderly often needed more warmth and had less ability to create it through labor. They relied more heavily on household generosity and structure. A respected elder in a stable family might be protected carefully. Someone isolated or poor faced a much harsher season. Winter exposed whether kinship obligations were real or merely spoken. There is also something important in how medieval people described winter spiritually. Cold was physical, but it also became moral language. Sermons and religious writing used winter as metaphor. Hardness of heart, seasons of trial, spiritual barrenness. But these metaphors worked because everyone understood them bodily. To speak of warmth, shelter, and fire was to speak in universally felt terms. Charity was imagined through heat because heat was one of the clearest forms of mercy. Saints' stories often included exposure, endurance, miraculous survival, or the offering of shelter to strangers. These were not decorative narrative choices. They reflected genuine moral imagination built around vulnerability to the elements. To protect someone from winter was to perform visible goodness. Even festivals of the colder months, Christmas, Epiphany, local feasts, carried part of their emotional force from this contrast. Light against darkness, food against scarcity, gathering against isolation, fire against cold stone. The religious meaning was primary, but the physical experience intensified it. A feast in deep winter felt different from abundance in harvest season because it pushed directly against the season's pressure. And still, for all these structures of meaning, winter remained stubbornly practical. If the roof leaked, symbolism did not help. If the chimney drew badly, theology did not clear the smoke. Medieval people could hold spiritual explanation and material frustration together without confusion. They prayed and they also repaired shutters. They attended Mass and they also worried about wet firewood. Their world did not separate belief from maintenance as neatly as modern people sometimes imagine. One of the quieter transformations of the later medieval world was the increasing availability of objects that made domestic winter slightly more manageable. Metalwork improved household tools. Better hinges, stronger locks, sturdier pots, warming devices, improved grates, and more specialized furnishings all contributed to comfort in ways too small for epic history, but enormous in lived experience. Civilization often advances through hinges and blankets more than speeches. Lighting changed winter life too. Candles were costly, and light was rationed carefully. Rushlights, tallow candles, beeswax for the wealthy or sacred spaces. Each had its place. Long winter evenings were shaped by what kind of light a household could afford. Reading, sewing, writing accounts, private devotion, storytelling, all depended on flame. Warmth and light were siblings in the same economy. To burn more for one often meant sacrificing more of the other. This made darkness itself part of winter domestic life. Medieval evenings were genuinely dark in ways difficult for modern people to fully imagine. Beyond the hearth and limited candlelight, much of the house withdrew into shadow. Rooms disappeared. Movement slowed. Sounds became more noticeable. Wind at shutters, animals shifting below, footsteps on stairs, the hiss of damp wood catching fire. Winter nights felt larger because visibility shrank. That darkness encouraged both fear and intimacy. Stories were told there. Worries were felt there. Illness seemed longer there. Lovers whispered there. Prayers lingered there. The psychological landscape of winter was shaped as much by limited light as by cold air. It is tempting to ask when all of this finally changed, when warmth became ordinary rather than defended. But history resists such clean boundaries. For one household, it may have been the first reliable chimney. For another, access to better wool. For another, a shift to urban life with purchased coal. For another, simply enough income to stop rationing every stick of wood with dread. And for many, the answer was much later than we assume. Even as courts grew richer and cities more sophisticated, enormous numbers of people across Europe still lived with winter as their grandparents had. Improvement was uneven, reversible, and dependent on fortune. A war, a bad harvest, a lord's demand, a sick animal, a roof collapse. Any of these could pull a household backward into older vulnerabilities. Comfort was not a staircase climbed once. It had to be defended like the fire itself. Perhaps that is why so many household instructions from the late medieval world sound less like luxury manuals and more like survival guides disguised as order. Keep stores dry. Repair before frost. Protect the sick room. Watch the servants' use of fuel. Mend wool before it fails. Close the shutters early. Air bedding when the weather allows. Manage the animals carefully. Nothing here sounds romantic, but together they form the real architecture of warmth. And behind all of it stood the same old lesson. Winter punished neglect faster than summer did. A loose shutter ignored in August became suffering in January. A poor harvest hidden by autumn markets became fear by February. A damaged cloak postponed too long became illness on the road. Medieval people learned to think seasonally because the consequences arrived seasonally. Which means that by the time the first real frost silvered the fields and smoke began to hang lower over roofs and lanes, most households were already making judgments that would determine how the rest of winter would feel. The season did not begin with snow. It began much earlier, in preparation, in memory, and in the quiet question every family understood. Would this year's warmth be enough? Autumn, more than January, decided the emotional shape of a medieval winter. The first cold morning mattered, certainly, but by then the real work had already begun. Fields had been judged. Grain had been counted. Firewood had been cut or purchased. Roofs had been checked for weakness. Salted meat, if there was enough to salt, had been stored. Ale had been brewed. Linen had been repaired. Cloaks had been examined with a practical eye that asked not whether they looked respectable, but whether they would still protect the body in February. Preparation was not simply good household management. It was a form of prediction. Families were trying to guess the future using weather, memory, rumor, and experience. Had the summer been wet enough to threaten fuel stores? Had the harvest been weaker than neighbors admitted? Were prices in the market already shifting? Had livestock entered the cold season strong or thin? Medieval people did not control winter, but they watched for its intentions with extraordinary attention. That attentiveness could become almost superstitious to modern eyes, though often it was built on generations of observation. The behavior of animals, the timing of frost, the condition of stored grain, the movement of birds, the smell of the air before rain, the thickness of autumn mud, these details mattered because they were evidence. A household that misread the signs might discover too late that what looked like an ordinary season was becoming something far worse. Markets reflected this anxiety before snow ever fell. Would sellers, grain merchants, butchers, brewers, cloth dealers, all participated in the same seasonal tension. Prices could rise with rumor alone. People bought not only goods but reassurance. A family with enough fuel stacked visibly outside the house projected stability. A household still bargaining desperately for firewood late in the season announced vulnerability. This visibility shaped social judgment. Medieval communities watched one another closely because survival was collective even when resources were private. A widow short on wood, a tenant forced to sell livestock too early, a merchant quietly buying grain in unusual quantity. These were noticed. Winter preparation was public information. The village, the street, the parish all became a kind of informal accounting system. This is one reason charity often intensified before the hardest cold arrived. Giving food or fuel in late autumn could prevent a winter crisis more effectively than emergency generosity in February. Monasteries, guilds, parishes, and wealthy households understood this unevenly, but the principle was familiar. Relief delayed too long was often relief made less useful. A family already deep in hunger could not easily recover just because help finally arrived. At the same time, preparation itself required resources, which meant the people who needed winter planning most were often the least able to do it well. A poor laborer paid by the day might understand perfectly that more firewood should be stored, but knowledge did not create money. A peasant family could know that another blanket would matter and still be unable to spare the wool or coin. Medieval wisdom was often brutally practical, and practicality could be painful precisely because it revealed the obvious solution one could not afford. This creates another important correction to romantic ideas about the past. Medieval people were not failing to prepare because they were careless or primitive. More often, they were balancing impossible choices. Buy fuel now or preserve coin for rent. Keep the pig longer for breeding value. or slaughter earlier to guarantee winter meat. Repair the roof, or replace the shoes that would fail in frozen weather. There was often no ideal answer, only the least dangerous one. And because so much depended on stored goods, winter gave objects a kind of moral seriousness they no longer hold for most of us. A blanket was not just fabric. It was margin. A full grain chest was not abundance. It was time. A dry stack of wood was not convenience. It was confidence. Even candles, modest and easily overlooked, represented planning. Light after sunset was purchased in advance. That relationship to objects shaped emotional life. To waste food, spill ale, burn fuel carelessly, or damage clothing through neglect was not merely annoying. Could feel irresponsible in a way modern abundance often softens. Children were taught this early. Servants were judged by it. Marriage negotiations quietly depended on it. Competence was visible in how a household protected ordinary things from becoming future emergencies. Marriage itself was deeply tied to winter logic. A household was an economic unit before it was a sentimental ideal, and cold seasons made that reality obvious. A good spouse meant labor shared, stores managed, illness faced with help rather than alone. Widows and widowers often remarried quickly, not because affection was absent, but because domestic survival was practical. A winter household without enough capable hands could become fragile very quickly. This is especially visible in rural life, where the rhythm of seasons structured nearly everything. Summer rewarded expansion, fields, animals, roads, trade. Winter punished overconfidence. It exposed weak roofs, poor fences, inadequate fodder, bad accounting, and unresolved tensions inside families. It was the season in which management became visible, and management extended to emotion as well. Patience mattered. Irritability had consequences in crowded rooms. Long evenings, repeated tasks, limited privacy, and constant smoke created a particular kind of fatigue. Medieval advice literature, household instruction, and religious writing often emphasize order, restraint, and mutual obligation, not only because moralists like discipline, but because winter made disorder harder to survive. Anger in a summer field could disperse. Anger in a smoky room with nowhere to go lasted longer. Children crying at night, animals restless below, someone coughing for weeks, damp boots by the fire, fuel running low, everyone aware of it but trying not to say it too directly. This was the emotional weather of winter far more often than snow-covered silence. Domestic peace was not decorative. It was a survival strategy. There is also something revealing in how medieval people understood sleep during winter. Darkness came early. Artificial light was expensive. Labor followed daylight. But sleep itself was not always a simple, uninterrupted block as modern people imagine. Many historians note references to segmented sleep, periods of first sleep and second sleep, with waking time in between for prayer, thought, quiet work, or conversation. In winter, with long nights and the fire needing attention, this rhythm could feel natural. Imagine the house after midnight. Most of the room dark, embers still alive, someone rising briefly to check the fire, another half awake listening to wind against shutters, the cold strongest at the edges of the bed curtains, breath visible in the dim light if the room had cooled enough. Sleep was not separate from the work of warmth. Even rest required maintenance. This is also why servants and apprentices often occupied such complex positions inside households. They were both family-adjacent and structurally unequal, sharing winter intimacy without equal comfort. They slept nearby, worked the fires, carried fuel, dressed children, checked shutters, and often experienced the physical labor of warmth more directly than the people they served. The polished surface of noble domestic life rested on many invisible cold mornings handled by someone else. For women in childbirth, winter could be particularly dangerous. Warmth was not symbolic comfort here. It was a serious practical concern. The birthing chamber was often intentionally heated and enclosed, not because of vague tradition alone, but because exposure and weakness carried obvious risks. Linen had to be dry, water had to be warm. Recovery depended heavily on the household's ability to create protection. A wealthy birth and a poor birth could take place in radically different physical worlds even within the same town. The same was true of death. Medieval death was far more domestic than modern institutional death. Illness, decline, vigil, prayer, and final care happened inside the household. In winter, that meant the sick room became one of the most important spaces in the house. Fuel was prioritized there. Visitors moved carefully there. The body's fragility made warmth suddenly sacred. A room kept warm for the dying tells us as much about medieval values as any cathedral. And still, people laughed, celebrated, flirted, argued, and lived ordinary lives through all of this. It is important not to let winter turn the medieval world into a museum of suffering. People adapted so thoroughly that much of what sounds exhausting to us simply felt normal to them. Children still played. Feast days still brought music and excess. Markets still gossiped. Courtship still happened near hearths and church doors. People complained, certainly, but they also built memory inside these conditions. In fact, winter sometimes intensified pleasure precisely because comfort was scarce. Fresh bread near a fire, dry socks after travel, warm ale, sunlight entering a cold room, a guest arriving safely before dark. Small satisfactions gained unusual weight. Scarcity sharpened appreciation. Medieval happiness often lived in places too ordinary for grand history to notice. This may be why so many later nostalgic images of the Middle Ages focus on hearths, halls, candles, and winter gathering. They capture something emotionally true, but they often remove the labor underneath it. The glow was real. So was the chopping, carrying, rationing, smoke, and anxiety required to create it. Romance without effort is not history, but effort without warmth is not truth either. And perhaps nowhere is that balance clearer than in the kitchen. The kitchen was not simply where food was made. In many households, it was the practical center of winter life. Fire lived there most reliably. People moved through it constantly. Heat, smell, labor, and conversation concentrated there. The kitchen was often warmer than more formal rooms because it had to be. Bread ovens, boiling pots, roasting spits, and constant motion made it the most physically alive part of the house. Servants, children, old relatives, dogs, gossip, repairs, arguments, and everyday negotiations all passed through that warmth. If the great hall represented status, the kitchen represented survival. In winter, those were not always the same thing. Even noble households, with all their ceremony, depended on kitchens that were loud, smoky, exhausting, and deeply practical. A feast admired in the hall began as sweat and timing near flame. Comfort in one room was often purchased by labor in another. And so, when frost returned year after year, medieval Europe did not meet it with one single experience. It met it through thousands of kitchens, chambers, barns, monasteries, workshops, and sick rooms, through people counting wood, touching walls, judging weather, and asking the same question their parents had asked before them. Not whether winter would be hard. That was assumed. But whether this particular winter would remain ordinary, or whether, somewhere between the first cold rain and the final weeks before spring, it would become the kind of season people remembered for the rest of their lives. They were remembered because ordinary rules stopped working. The bread ran out earlier than it should have. The woodpile looked smaller every morning no matter how carefully it was rationed. The cow weakened. The road to town became unreliable. The priest mentioned unusual charity from the pulpit. A neighbor who never borrowed anything asked quietly for fuel. The pond froze thicker than anyone expected. The old people in the village began comparing the season to winters from decades before, and younger people listened more carefully than usual. This is how extraordinary winters entered memory, not first as weather, but as a slow rearrangement of normal life. In medieval Europe, memory often worked through comparison. People judged a season against the remembered winters of parents and grandparents. Not since was one of the most powerful ways to describe danger. Records from monasteries and chronicles often preserve this language because communities themselves understood winter through lived precedent. If old men at the hearth said they had not seen a river freeze like this since childhood, that was information. It meant the season had crossed from discomfort into history. One of the most famous examples, though far from the only one, is the series of harsh winters that contributed to larger crises in the late medieval world. Climate was never the sole cause of famine or instability, but weather could expose the fragility already present in a system. A harvest weakened by rain, followed by a cold winter, followed by spring that arrived too late. This sequence could be devastating. Medieval households did not fail because one snowstorm appeared. They failed because several ordinary pressures aligned without enough margin to absorb them. This is perhaps the central lesson of warmth in medieval life. Survival depended less on heroic endurance than on margin. A family with one extra sack of grain, one healthy ox, one relative able to help, one roof repaired in time, one reliable access to woodland. These small differences mattered enormously. Winter punished thin margins. It turned almost enough into not enough at all. That is why famine stories from the medieval period are often stories of winter even when the original cause began in summer. Hunger ripened slowly. The bad harvest announced itself in autumn, but winter made it intimate. It brought the problem indoors. It made it visible at the table, in the pace of children, in the arguments over portions, in the silence around a nearly empty storage chest. And hunger changed the feeling of cold itself. A well-fed body experiences winter differently from a weakened one. Medieval people understood this without needing modern nutritional language. Thin pottage and reduced bread meant more than dissatisfaction. They meant the cold settled deeper. A person working outdoors with less food, thinner clothing, and fewer reserves did not merely dislike winter more. They lived inside a different level of risk. This created cruel choices. Should remaining grain be preserved for seed, protecting next year at the cost of this winter's hunger? Should livestock be slaughtered now for immediate food, or kept alive in hope of future recovery? Should rent still be paid in full, risking the household's own reserves, or delayed with dangerous consequences from the Lord? These were not moral failures. They were structural traps, and the poor rarely made these choices alone. Winter hunger altered relationships across entire communities. Village charity could be generous, but it also carried memory. Everyone knew who had helped last year and who had not. Everyone noticed who gave publicly and who avoided responsibility. Social trust was tested in cold weather because generosity had real cost. A loaf of bread given in spring was kindness. A loaf given in February might be sacrifice. The church stood inside this moral economy in complicated ways. Sermons on charity had sharper edges when the congregation could feel the cold in the building. Almsgiving, hospitality, and protection of the vulnerable were not abstract virtues. They could be measured in blankets, soup, and firewood. Monasteries often served as practical centers of relief, but they were also limited institutions with their own stores to protect. Compassion existed inside scarcity, not outside it. Even kings and governments, distant as they could seem, were not untouched by winter's politics. Grain shortages, fuel scarcity, frozen transport routes, and urban unrest could quickly become matters of governance. A ruler who could not stabilize bread prices in a hard season felt less legitimate. A town where the poor froze visibly became politically dangerous. Cold had administrative consequences. This is why winter appears so often in tax records, legal complaints, and estate management documents. Not because people were unusually poetic about weather, but because weather changed numbers. Less rent collected, more repairs needed, more animals lost, more disputes over common land, more pressure on charity. Winter left paperwork behind because it left financial damage behind. And still, daily life continued inside these larger pressures. A blacksmith still had to keep iron workable. A baker still had to rise before dawn. A widow still had to manage her own fire. A shepherd still had to judge whether an animal could survive another week. A mother still had to convince a child to leave a warm bed for a freezing morning. History often prefers crisis as spectacle, but most winter hardship was repetition. There is something revealing in the soundscape of it. Modern heating is largely silent. Medieval warmth was noisy, would split, fires hissed and cracked, wind pressed at shutters, animals shifted in lower rooms, pots simmered, doors swelled in damp weather and complained when opened, shoes dried stiffly by the hearth, someone coughed in the next bed, someone rose in darkness to stir embers. Winter was heard as much as felt. That constant sensory presence made the season psychologically intimate. There was no forgetting it. Cold was in the walls, in the floorboards, in the smell of wet while steaming near the fire, in the way hands hesitated before touching wash water. Medieval winter did not sit politely outside the window. It occupied the house. This is part of why travel narratives from the period can feel so vivid when they mention shelter. Arriving at an inn, a monastery, or a manor before dark was not only convenient. It was relief from exposure. To be welcomed with a seat near the fire, hot broth, and dry straw for a horse was a serious act of safety. Hospitality was remembered because winter made it unforgettable. And yet inns themselves were rarely comfortable by modern standards. Drafty rooms, shared beds, uncertain cleanliness, smoke, and noise were common, but comparison mattered. After road cold, almost any enclosed warmth felt like abundance. Medieval comfort was often relative rather than absolute. Relief was measured against worse alternatives. This same relativity shaped ideas of luxury. A modern person might imagine luxury in terms of decoration, gold, velvet, carved furniture. Medieval winter often translated luxury into simpler forms. A room that stayed warm, dry boots, enough candles to read by, bed linen that did not smell of dampness, a servant whose job included keeping the fire right. Wealth was beautiful partly because it made ordinary suffering less constant. Even perfume and scented herbs, often discussed as markers of refinement, were linked to enclosed winter life. Houses trapped smells. Smoke, rushes, animals, cooking, illness, and poor drainage created an atmosphere people were deeply aware of. Sweet herbs, rush strewing, incense, and scented objects were not just vanity. They were responses to real sensory conditions, intensified when windows stayed closed against cold. The same was true of bathing. People often repeat the simple myth that medieval Europeans never bathed, but the reality was far more complicated. Bathing practices changed by place, class, and century. Public bathhouses existed in many towns. Private washing mattered. Hands, faces, linens, and practical cleanliness were not ignored. But winter made bathing physically difficult. Heating enough water cost fuel. Undressing in a cold room was unpleasant. Drying afterward required care. The question was rarely whether cleanliness mattered, but how much warmth one could afford to spend on it. This is another quiet contradiction of winter life. Hygiene, comfort, and economy were often in tension. A perfectly sensible act like washing thoroughly could become an expensive thermal decision. Laundry carried the same problem. Linen needed cleaning, but wet fabric in winter was a household challenge. Drying indoors increased dampness. Drying outdoors risked freezing or slow failure. Cleanliness, therefore, depended not only on discipline, but on weather and available space. Domestic order was always partly climate management. And then there was the body itself, the way winter changed posture and movement. People stood differently when cold. They worked differently. They sat closer together. They conserved effort without necessarily naming it. Fingers became clumsier. Writing could be physically harder. Metal tools felt sharper to hold. Prayer in an unheated church was not only spiritual discipline but literal endurance. Medieval winter trained the body into habits of economy. That bodily memory lasted. Someone who had survived repeated hard winters did not think about warmth as a luxury category. They thought about it as competence, as foresight, as moral seriousness. A careless person wasted heat. A wise person respected it. This helps explain why household advice literature can sound almost stern about ordinary things. Mend the cloak now. Keep the roof sound. Do not waste candles. Watch the grain. These are not fussy domestic instructions. They are survival ethics formed by climate. And children raised inside that ethic carried it forward. They learned not only how to survive winter, but how to judge adults by it. Was the father provident? Was the mother orderly? Were the servants trustworthy? Did the Lord protect the tenants? Did the monastery feed the poor? Winter answered these questions with uncomfortable honesty. Perhaps that is why spring in medieval writing can feel almost emotional in a way modern readers sometimes underestimate. It was not merely seasonal prettiness. It was release from judgment. Surviving winter meant something had held together. Family, stores, animals, obligations, luck. Spring was not just warmth returning. It was proof that the household had endured. But not everyone crossed that threshold equally. Some entered spring with weakened bodies, sold tools, missing animals, and debts that would shape the entire next year. Others emerged with stores intact, servants healthy, and enough reserve to think beyond mere survival. Winter did not simply test existing inequality. It often widened it. This is why staying warm in medieval Europe was never really a story about fireplaces alone. It was a story about power, about architecture, about labor hidden inside comfort, about women's domestic intelligence, about servants rising before dawn, about forests and laws and markets, about sick rooms and kitchens and crowded beds, about the moral meaning of hospitality, and about the frighteningly thin line between an ordinary season and a remembered one. And sometimes, in the deepest cold, when roads disappeared under ice and the fire had to be watched through the night, people could feel that line narrowing, until a household that had seemed stable in autumn found itself waiting in silence for the one thing no one could control: the weather to change. There are kinds of work measured in movement: cutting wood, carrying water, repairing roofs, feeding animals. And then there is the quieter work of endurance, the long mental discipline of living through a season that refuses to move quickly enough. Medieval winter demanded both. It asked for action where action was possible, and patience where it was not. That second demand is easier to overlook, but for many households it was just as exhausting. By late winter, the problem was often no longer the beauty or drama of snow, but attrition. February could be harder than December. The first cold carried preparation and alertness. The later cold carried fatigue. By then, the house had been closed against damp air for months. Fuel stores had visibly diminished. Preserved food had lost variety and freshness. Illness lingered longer. Clothes showed wear. The body remembered cold even on milder days. People were not simply enduring weather, they were enduring repetition. This was sometimes called the hungry gap in later rural memory, the stretch before spring growth truly arrived, when winter stores were weakest and the new season had not yet become useful. Medieval people knew this period intimately even if they used different local language for it. It was the time when optimism became difficult. A family might have survived the worst frosts and still find March more dangerous because resources had quietly thinned beyond comfort. Fresh vegetables were limited. Salted foods, grain, pottage, dried peas, onions, stored roots. These remain the backbone of many diets, but appetite and morale are not the same thing. The body can survive monotony. The mind feels it. Feast days mattered partly because they interrupted that sameness. A richer meal in winter was not only nourishment. It was psychological proof that abundance still existed somewhere beyond the cold routine. This helps explain why seasonal rituals carried such emotional force. Candlemas, Christmas, local saints' feasts, the approach of Lent, the eventual signs of Easter. These were spiritual markers, but they were also anchors in time. They told people the season was moving even when the landscape looked unchanged. Winter can distort time. Ritual gave it structure. Church bells in winter had a different kind of presence. Sound traveled through cold air differently, sharper and clearer across frozen fields and quiet streets. Bells marked prayer, warning, mourning, celebration, and order. In a season where darkness arrived early and travel narrowed, sound helped hold community together. The bell was proof that life beyond one's own cold room still continued. Even animals seemed to participate in the emotional calendar of winter. Chickens laying less reliably, horses needing more careful management, sheep weakened by poor grazing, dogs drawn closer to hearths, cats claiming the warmest corners. People noticed these changes because animals were not separate from household life. Their behavior marked the season as surely as frost on the window. There is also a practical irony in how much medieval people depended on things that winter made harder to obtain. Water, for example, sounds simple until it freezes. A frozen well, an icy path to the stream, the physical pain of washing clothes or carrying buckets in bitter wind. These transformed an ordinary necessity into repeated strain. Water had to be fetched regardless of weather. Illness did not pause because the ground was hard. Kitchens still required boiling, cleaning, brewing, and washing. Winter did not reduce the need for labor. It made familiar labor heavier. The same was true for bread. Bread was so central to medieval life that its absence altered the emotional atmosphere of a house. Grain shortages, poor milling, or rising prices were felt immediately because bread was not a side dish. It was structure. Different classes ate different kinds, of course. Fine white bread for the wealthy, darker coarser loaves for the poor, maslin breads of mixed grain, rye where wheat was difficult. But across class, bread meant predictability. When bread became uncertain, the whole household felt unstable. The oven, then, was a kind of winter clock. In villages with communal ovens or in households with their own baking rhythms, the making of bread structured time and reassurance. The smell itself carried meaning. It said something was still under control. That is one reason famine memories are often described not first through starvation, but through substitutions. Bark mixed into flour. Inferior grains used reluctantly. Meals stretched thinner. Bread becoming smaller, darker, stranger. Medieval people understood decline through these details because decline rarely arrived dramatically at first. It arrived as adjustment. Adjustment was the true language of winter. One less candle tonight. One more blanket moved to the sick room. One animal sold sooner than planned. One servant dismissed. One journey postponed. One prayer added for a thaw. The season taught people to think in increments. And because everything was connected, small changes spread outward. A roof leak meant damp bedding, which meant poorer sleep, which meant weaker labor, which meant less efficient work, which meant slower recovery. A shortage of fuel meant colder washing, which meant less willingness to clean, which affected illness and morale. Medieval households were ecosystems before anyone used that word. Winter tested how well those systems held together. This becomes especially clear when we look at illness. Respiratory problems, joint pain, infections worsened by dampness, complications from childbirth, the vulnerability of infants, the slow weakness of old age. Winter amplified all of them. Medieval medicine could offer care, but often the most important treatment was environmental. Warmth, dryness, broth, rest, and enough human attention to keep decline from accelerating. A fever in July and a fever in January were not the same event. This is why the sick room could become the moral center of the house. Who gave up the warmest space? Who sacrificed fuel? Who sat awake at night? Illness turned warmth into visible love or visible neglect. A well-tended winter illness said something about a family beyond medicine. And yet medieval people did not only fear winter, they also expected certain forms of beauty from it. Snow on fields, candlelight in chapel windows, frost along monastery walls, the quiet after heavy weather, the sense of enclosure when everyone had finally returned indoors before dark. These moments existed too. Beauty was not absent. It simply lived beside difficulty rather than replacing it. This balance is important because modern imagination tends to choose one extreme. Either medieval winter becomes a picturesque Christmas card, or it becomes endless misery. Real life was stranger. People could admire frost and dread what it meant for the sheep. They could love the firelight and resent the labor required to keep it alive. They could enjoy feast days and still count every log afterward. The wealthy, of course, could soften these contradictions more effectively. Royal courts and noble households sometimes turned winter into a season of display. Hunting, feasts, music, tournaments, indoor entertainments, elaborate hospitality. Winter at court could look almost luxurious. But even here, the physical truth remained underneath the pageantry. Fires still needed tending. Great halls still lost heat. Travel to court was still difficult. The servants still rose in darkness. Luxury did not abolish winter. It organized it differently. In fact, courts often revealed the same basic principle more clearly. Comfort required invisible labor. Warm rooms for the few depended on exhausting work for the many. Firewood cut, carried, stacked. Kitchens running before sunrise. Laundry dried in impossible conditions. Beds prepared. Floors managed. Wet cloaks handled. Horses stabled. Guests fed. Winter luxury was built from countless ordinary tasks performed by people who often experienced far less comfort than the people they served. This is not unique to the Middle Ages, of course, but winter made it unusually visible. Even law courts and politics felt the season. Parliament, royal councils, local disputes, all operated within the constraints of weather and warmth. Travel delays changed decisions. Illness altered attendance. Bad roads shaped governance. A ruler could not entirely separate political authority from the material realities of season. The kingdom itself moved differently in winter. For soldiers, too, cold could be more decisive than battle. Campaigns slowed, supplies mattered more, and shelter became strategic. A poorly provisioned army in winter could collapse through hunger and exposure without dramatic combat. Siege warfare, in particular, made warmth brutally important. A castle under siege in winter was not only a military problem but a thermal one. Fuel, food, blankets, animal survival, and morale all narrowed together. Which reminds us again that warmth was never just domestic. It was political, military, and economic. Even forests changed under that pressure. Woodland was not a scenic background to medieval life. It was an energy reserve. Managed woodland, coppicing practices, rites of gathering, charcoal production, hunting restrictions, all of this connected directly to the simple question of whether people could keep warm. Forest law could feel oppressive because it interfered with something immediate. A branch denied was not symbolic injustice. It might be next week's cold room. In some places, people turned increasingly toward other fuels, peat in marsh regions, coal in certain urban settings later on, brush and dung where little else existed. Each had its own smell, labor, and social meaning. Fuel was local history made physical. You could often smell a region's economy before you could explain it. And smell, perhaps more than sight, defined winter interiors. Smoke in wool, damp wood, wet leather, stew thickening slowly, rushes on the floor beginning to sour, beeswax in wealthier homes, tallow in poorer ones. Herbs hung for both use and air, the sharpness of cold air when a door opened. Medieval warmth had a scent profile modern central heating has erased entirely. This matters because memory often lives through smell. A person could remember a winter through the odor of a room long after forgetting the exact year. The house itself carried seasons in its fabric. By the end of a hard winter, walls looked tired. Clothing looked tired. People looked tired. But then the smallest sign of change. A softer morning, dripping eaves, mud replacing frozen ground, birds returning, sunlight lingering slightly longer at supper, could alter the emotional balance of an entire village. Hope in medieval winter was often practical before it was poetic. It looked like being able to wash without pain. It looked like the first animal grazing again. It looked like fewer people coughing at church. It looked like fuel lasting long enough. It looked like not having to think about the fire every single hour. And yet, even with spring approaching, no one relaxed too quickly, because experienced households knew winter's final trick: false endings. A mild week followed by a killing frost. Roads opening only to flood. Seed threatened by late cold. Animals weakened just when recovery seemed near. Medieval people learned caution from repetition. Relief had to be earned, not assumed. So they watched. They always watched. The sky, the roads, the animals, the stores, the faces of neighbors, the smoke from chimneys, the priest's tone, the market price of grain, the feel of the floor under bare feet in the morning. These were the instruments by which ordinary people measured whether the season was finally loosening its grip. And until they were certain, the same ritual continued each evening. Someone checked the shutters. Someone counted what fuel remained. Someone made sure the embers were banked properly for the night. And everyone, whether rich or poor, noble or peasant, understood that tomorrow's comfort would depend on how carefully that small circle of fire survived until morning. And that small circle of fire, protected so carefully each night, was perhaps the most honest symbol of medieval winter life. Fragile, necessary, and never entirely secure. People today often think of warmth as a background condition, something expected so completely that it becomes invisible. In medieval Europe, warmth was visible because it could disappear. It had shape, labor, and cost. It lived in specific places. The hearth, the oven, the bed, the kitchen, the infirmary, the stable, the chamber where an old parent slept, the bench nearest the wall hanging that blocked the draft. Warmth was geography. If you entered a medieval house in winter, you would have understood that geography almost immediately. You would notice where people naturally gathered, where the dog preferred to sleep, where boots were drying, where damp cloaks were hung, where children were kept closest to supervision and heat, where servants passed most often, and where older people sat when their joints ached. The warmest places were not accidental. They were the result of choices repeated daily. This arrangement shaped conversation as much as comfort. People talked where warmth allowed them to linger. News was exchanged there. Repairs were made there. Courtship often happened in the edges of those shared spaces, in kitchens and halls and by fires rather than in the privacy modern people imagine. Authority, too, sat near the hearth. The person controlling fuel, food, and access to heat often controlled more than temperature. Even silence changed around fire. In a winter room lit by flame, pauses were different. People listened to wood settling, to the kettle beginning to move, to wind along the outer wall. Not every moment needed speech because the environment itself was present. This is one reason long evenings could feel both intimate and heavy. People were close enough to share warmth, but also close enough to feel every mood. Winter deepened households because it reduced distance, and sometimes that closeness revealed uncomfortable truths. A family that functioned well in summer could strain in winter. Limited food sharpened old resentments. Illness exposed hidden neglect. A marriage that looked stable in public might feel colder indoors than the weather outside. Servants noticed more than they said. Children understood more than adults assumed. Winter made domestic reality harder to disguise because everyone was physically forced into the same small spaces. This is part of why household reputation mattered so much. A well-run home was admired not only for wealth, but for order under pressure. Guests noticed whether rooms felt prepared, whether food arrived smoothly, whether old people were comfortable, whether servants moved with confidence rather than panic. Winter hospitality revealed competence more clearly than summer abundance ever could. And competence often depended on women whose names never entered formal history. The mistress of a manor, the wife of a merchant, the widow holding together a smaller household, the older female relative whose memory of previous hard seasons guided decisions. These figures shaped winter survival constantly. Medieval records often preserve men's legal authority, but practical domestic resilience frequently rested elsewhere. Knowing how much grain remained, which servant could be trusted with stores, how to protect linen from damp, when a child's cough had become serious, how to stretch fuel without inviting misery. This was expertise, even if it was rarely written like one. There is a tendency to treat domestic labor as secondary to real history, but winter exposes the mistake in that thinking. If a kingdom survives but households fail, the kingdom becomes an empty idea. Firewood, broth, blankets, roof repair, dry shoes, and good judgment were political realities wearing ordinary clothes. The same was true for monasteries and convents, where domestic order and spiritual order were often inseparable. A monastery could pray beautifully and still suffer if its stores were poorly managed. The discipline of the cloister included practical winter intelligence. Preserving fuel, protecting books from damp, keeping infirmaries warm enough, feeding guests, maintaining routine when weather encouraged collapse into disorder. Silence and prayer required infrastructure. Books themselves reveal this world in quiet ways. Manuscripts copied in winter might carry the signs of cold hands and dim light. Scribes complained, sometimes directly, about freezing fingers, poor light, and the physical misery of writing in cold scriptoria. We tend to imagine books as products of pure scholarship, but in winter they were also products of bodily endurance. Ink thickened, hands stiffened, candlelight cost money, knowledge had temperature. This applies equally to law, administration, and record-keeping. A clerk writing accounts in January was not doing abstract office work. He was working in a room whose warmth affected concentration, speed, and comfort. Medieval bureaucracy, like everything else, sat closer to the fire if it could. There is also a strange democratic quality to winter. Not equality, certainly, class differences remain severe, but even the wealthy could not fully ignore the season. A lord might own more furs and better walls, but he still understood drafty stone, the dependence on servants to maintain fires, the anxiety of delayed supplies, the danger of illness spreading indoors. Winter crossed class boundaries even while it treated classes differently. Perhaps that is why it appears so often in literature as a moral season. Not simply because it was harsh, but because it clarified priorities. Generosity mattered more. Waste looked uglier. Hospitality became memorable. Pride in luxury without competence felt ridiculous when a chimney smoked badly or a guest shivered at table. Winter reduced pretenses. It asked whether a household could actually protect the people inside it. Even romance in medieval stories and real life changed under that pressure. Courtship in winter had fewer open fields and longer evenings indoors. Letters, visits under supervision, shared feast days, glances in halls, conversations near kitchens and chapels. Warmth and visibility shaped intimacy. Love, like everything else, moved through architecture. Marriage negotiations often carried practical thermal logic beneath the language of alliance. Could this union create a stable household? Were there enough resources, enough labor, enough family support to survive bad years? Affection mattered, but winter had a way of insisting on realism. A charming husband who could not manage stores was a dangerous luxury. Children learned these truths without formal instruction. They learned where to stand, what not to waste, how to read adults by the way they spoke about fuel, how to move quietly when someone was ill, how to recognize the sound of worry in a kitchen. Winter was education. It taught hierarchy, patience, caution, and gratitude in ways sermons only reinforced. It also taught fear. Not dramatic fear, usually, but the slow fear of uncertainty. Would the cough worsen? Would the road reopen? Would the pig survive? Would the thaw come too early and flood the lower field? Would there be enough grain left for both bread and seed? Medieval anxiety was often agricultural and domestic before it was philosophical. That may be why prayers around winter were often so practical. People prayed for weather, for safe travel, for animals, for children, for relief from illness, for protection of crops not yet planted. Spiritual life did not float above material concerns. It lived inside them. A prayer for warmth was a prayer for order. And yet, despite all this seriousness, winter could also create moments of surprising leisure. When travel stopped and outdoor labor narrowed, some households, especially wealthier ones, had more time for games, music, storytelling, embroidery, reading aloud, and forms of social life that summer's demands interrupted. Not because winter was easy, but because it rearranged labor rather than simply increasing it. The same long evenings that could feel oppressive could also create memory. This is one reason oral culture mattered so much. Stories told repeatedly by firelight were not decorative entertainment. They were part of how families understood themselves. Ancestors were remembered there. Old winters were compared there. Local disasters became cautionary tales. Children learned not just history, but household identity. Your grandfather survived the winter of. Your mother walked to market when the river froze. This house stood through the storm when. These stories made endurance hereditary. They taught that hardship was survivable because someone before you had already proved it. And in a world where official history rarely noticed ordinary people, that kind of memory mattered deeply. Even architecture carried memory. A repaired beam, a block draft, an extra wall added around a bed space, a kitchen moved for better heat, a chimney rebuilt after smoke trouble. Houses were records of previous winters. They remembered what hurt. Medieval homes were shaped by accumulated correction. This is perhaps the quietest form of progress. Not invention, but remembering where cold entered and refusing to let it happen again. A better shutter, a stronger latch, a thicker curtain, a different place for the cradle. A new habit of storing would hire off damp ground. Civilization often advances by someone deciding never to repeat last February. And still, no household ever solved winter completely. A rich year could be followed by a cruel one. A repaired roof could still leak under strange weather. A warm house could become cold if sickness removed the people who maintained it. Security was never permanent. Medieval people knew this instinctively. Their realism came not from pessimism, but from repetition. This may be why spring was received with such caution rather than immediate celebration. The first warm day did not erase winter. It tested whether winter had truly loosened its grip. Could the animals go farther? Could laundry dry properly? Could doors stay open longer without regret? Could the sick recover? Could travel begin again? Medieval hope was practical. It waited for evidence. And when that evidence came, it changed everything at once. The house smelled different. Smoke lifted differently. People stood outside longer without deciding to. Children ran farther from the door. Mud replaced ice, which was miserable in its own way, but it meant movement. The body stopped guarding itself every minute. Warmth, after months of management, returned almost like permission. But even then, experienced households were already thinking ahead. Because spring was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of preparing for the next winter. Fields had to be planted so future bread existed. Animals had to recover so future labor survived. Woodland had to be judged for future fuel. Clothing had to be repaired before memory softened the urgency. Promises made during scarcity had to be remembered or conveniently forgotten. Winter left debts, economic, emotional, and moral. Who helped? Who refused? Who endured quietly? Who broke? Who learned? Communities carried these answers into the warmer months, and they shaped the next cold season long before frost returned. So even as sunlight lengthened and people allowed themselves the first cautious relief, the logic of winter remained in the background, waiting patiently, reminding every household that comfort was never a permanent possession. It was something made, protected, lost, and made again, one season at a time. And because comfort was something made, protected, lost, and made again, medieval people rarely thought of winter as a separate chapter. It was woven into the entire year. Summer was never only summer. It was winter preparation in warmer clothes. A field of grain was future bread by the hearth. Sheep in summer pasture were future blankets, cloaks, and felt-lined survival. A repaired barn in August was a warmer January for both people and animals. Even laughter at harvest feasts carried an undertone of calculation, because everyone understood that abundance was only meaningful if enough of it crossed safely into the cold months ahead. This long seasonal memory shaped character in ways modern convenience often hides. Medieval patience was not simply personality. It was trained by repetition. You learned to think months ahead because weather forced you to. You learned that comfort tomorrow depended on discipline today. Waste in July could become suffering in February. The calendar itself taught responsibility. And that responsibility was social before it was individual. A village survived winter together or not at all. One family's neglect could affect others. A damaged boundary fence might weaken shared animals. A failed grain obligation could ripple into the Lord's demands on everyone else. A household too poor to manage fuel might turn to neighbors for help. Even gossip about who was prudent and who was careless had practical purpose. Reputation was a kind of communal forecasting. This is why medieval villages could feel both intimate and intrusive. People knew each other's winters. They knew whose chimney smoked steadily, whose children looked thin by late February, whose servants were overworked, whose old mother sat too close to the fire because her room was too cold. Privacy was limited not because people were unusually curious, but because survival produced visible evidence. The same dynamic shaped towns, though differently. In cities, anonymity was greater, but inequality was sharper. Wealth and poverty could exist almost wall to wall. One house with glazed windows and well-fed servants might stand near another where tenants counted every scrap of coal. Winter made those contrasts harder to ignore. Urban authorities sometimes tried to manage the tension, regulating bread prices, watching fuel supply, responding to visible suffering, but cities also concentrated risk. Fire spread faster. Disease spread faster. Hunger spread faster. A bad winter in a town could become public unrest with surprising speed because discomfort had witnesses. And this brings us to another important truth. Warmth was political because dependence creates power. Who controlled woodland rights? Who owned mills? Who regulated ovens? Who set rents? Who collected taxes when harvests failed? These decisions determined whether winter felt survivable or humiliating. Medieval power was often experienced not through distant speeches, but through whether a tenant could gather enough wood without punishment. That is why resentment around common land could be so fierce. To a lord, restricting access might look like order. To a peasant, it might mean a colder house and a weaker child. Large political structures were felt through very small domestic consequences. Even rebellion, when it came, often had roots in these repeated practical humiliations. People do not always rise because of grand ideology. Sometimes they rise because several winters in a row have made ordinary life feel impossible. And still, most years were not rebellion. Most years were management. A woman checking linen for mildew. A boy sent to gather fallen branches before dusk. A servant turning mattresses toward the drier side. A monk adjusting a shutter in the infirmary. A baker waking in darkness because dough did not care about weather. A merchant deciding whether to buy more fuel now or trust the market later. History moves through these scenes more often than through coronations. This is especially clear if we look at aging. For the elderly, winter was often the most revealing season of dependence. Joints ached more. Movement slowed. Falls became dangerous. Sleep changed. The body that had endured decades of winters understood them differently. Old people were often the keepers of seasonal memory precisely because they had lived through enough harsh years to compare them honestly. Their authority could be quiet but powerful. If an old woman said the grain was being used too quickly, people listened. If an old man said a certain frost meant trouble for spring planting, that memory carried weight. Medieval households valued experience because survival rewarded those who remembered patterns. There is something almost modern in that respect. Expertise did not always wear formal clothing. Sometimes it sat closest to the fire, speaking rarely and being right. Children, by contrast, experienced winter through rules before understanding reasons. Stay near the house. Do not waste candles. Close the door quickly. Wear the cap. Do not touch the stored grain. Keep away from the good blankets. Bring the smaller logs first. Help your sister with the water. Watch the embers. Only later did those rules reveal their full logic. Childhood in winter was an education in invisible systems. And because winter was repetitive, it also trained emotional memory. Adults remembered not just events, but feelings attached to seasons. The smell of a particular illness, the silence after livestock died, the relief of hearing rain instead of ice, the embarrassment of borrowing fuel, the comfort of a grandmother's bed curtains, the sound of a father checking the lock against wind. These were not minor details. They formed identity. That may be why medieval literature, when it describes warmth, often sounds more intimate than its descriptions of wealth. Gold can be admired from a distance. Warmth is understood through the body. A cloak given to the poor. A traveler welcomed to the fire. A child wrapped after illness. A widow receiving bread. A saint sharing shelter. These images endure because everyone knew exactly what they meant. Even legal language sometimes reflected this moral closeness. Duties of hospitality, obligations of care, rights of common use, these were not only administrative categories. They were ways societies tried, imperfectly, to decide who deserved protection from cold. Justice in winter could look very simple. Did people freeze who should not have frozen? Of course, many did. Medieval life was not secretly comfortable beneath all its romance. People died of exposure, of hunger made worse by cold, of illnesses that warmth might have softened but not cured. Children were lost. Old people faded. Travelers disappeared on bad roads. Servants worked past exhaustion. Not every household had enough wisdom or enough luck. It is important to keep that honesty because nostalgia can be a kind of forgetting. But honesty also requires remembering that medieval people were not passive victims waiting for modernity to rescue them. They were skilled managers of difficulty. They knew how to layer warmth, how to read weather, how to build habits around risk, how to preserve dignity inside discomfort. Their lives were harder in many ways, but not emptier and certainly not simpler. In fact, one of the strangest differences between their world and ours may be attention. When warmth is automatic, you stop noticing it. When warmth must be created, you notice everything. You notice which side of the room is colder. You notice how long bread keeps heat. You notice which servant forgets the shutters. You notice whether a guest is too polite to admit they are freezing. You notice if the dog refuses its usual sleeping place because the draft has changed. This constant attention created a domestic intelligence that modern central heating has quietly erased. Medieval people read houses the way sailors read weather. And houses answered back. Timber creaked differently in frost. Stone walls held memory of yesterday's temperature. Smoke revealed bad wind. Condensation on a window opening told its own story. A cold patch near the bed warned of trouble before illness arrived. Home was not a neutral container. It was an active participant in survival. This is one reason moving house, or marrying into a new household, could feel so significant. You had to learn a new winter geography. Which stair froze first? Which roof corner leaked? Which room held warmth longest? Which servant could be trusted with the night fire? Domestic belonging meant learning the building as much as the people. Even faith attached itself to these places. Household shrines, prayers near the hearth, blessings over food, rituals around feast days. Religion often entered through the spaces where vulnerability was strongest. A candle lit beside the sick bed was not abstract symbolism. It belonged to the same emotional world as soup and blankets. And perhaps that is the deepest reason winter mattered so much in medieval Europe. It stripped life down to essentials. Not ideals, but essentials. Food, fuel, shelter, company, memory, competence, mercy. Everything else arranged itself around those. A noble title mattered less in a room with no heat. A theological argument mattered less to a coughing child. A beautiful house mattered less if the chimney failed. A strong reputation mattered less if neighbors would not lend wood. Winter had a way of asking very direct questions. Can this household protect life? Can these people trust each other? Was the abundance of summer real, or only temporary theater? And because those questions returned every year, people built entire moral worlds around answering them well. So by the time late spring finally settled in, truly settled with no false frost waiting behind it, the relief was more than physical. It was reputational. It was spiritual. It was proof that another trial had been crossed without the house coming apart. The first washing done outdoors without pain. The first night a window stayed open a little longer. The first journey taken without fear of being trapped by weather. The first time someone forgot to think about the fire. These were quiet victories, but they mattered. And almost immediately, attention turned forward again. Because the sheep would need shearing. The walls needed checking. The roof remembered where it had leaked, would had to be cut while weather allowed. Children were growing and would need larger winter clothes. Promises made during scarcity would now be tested in comfort. Who would still be generous now? Who would forget? Summer, in that sense, was never innocent, carried the memory of cold inside it. And somewhere in every household, perhaps without saying it aloud, people were already beginning the oldest medieval calculation of all: how to make sure that when the nights turned dark again, and the wind returned to the shutters, there would still be enough warmth left to welcome it, and in the end, that may be the quiet truth hidden beneath all the grand stories of medieval Europe. Not the castles, though they were real, not the kings, though they mattered, not even the battles, plagues, or cathedrals that dominate so much of popular imagination, but the ordinary, repeated question asked in thousands of homes, across centuries, every time the light faded early and the cold pressed against the walls: will we be warm enough? For most people, history was lived there. It was lived in the kitchen before dawn, when someone bent over sleeping embers and tried to bring fire back to life. It was lived in damp wool drying too slowly by the hearth, in shared beds behind heavy curtains, in the careful counting of grain, in the decision to save one more log for tomorrow, in the relief of hearing rain instead of ice, in the smell of bread after weeks of worry, in the old woman who knew winter better than the priest did, in the servant who rose first and slept last because warmth had to be made before anyone else could enjoy it. Staying warm was never only about comfort. It was about class, because some people could buy protection and others could only endure. It was about labor, because every warm room was built by someone's effort. It was about gender, because household survival often rested on invisible domestic intelligence. It was about power, because forests, fuel, rents, and rights determined whose winter was bearable. It was about morality, because hospitality, charity, and neglect were felt through the body. And it was about memory, because every hard winter taught lessons that shaped the next one. The medieval world was not endlessly miserable, nor was it the glowing fantasy of candlelit romance we sometimes prefer. It was more human than either version. People complained. They adapted. They laughed in kitchens. They argued in smoky rooms. They prayed for weather. They remembered bad winters for decades. They made beauty where they could, and they protected warmth because they understood exactly what life felt like without it. Perhaps that is why spring meant so much. Not because flowers returned, though they did. Not because roads reopened, though they mattered. But because surviving winter meant something had held. The family, the stores, the roof, the animals, the fragile trust between neighbors, the household itself. Warmth, after all, was never permanent. It had to be made again and again through work, foresight, cooperation, and sometimes simple luck. And maybe that is the part modern life forgets most easily. We turn a switch and expect comfort. They built it every day with wood, wool, stone, patience, and attention. They knew the value of a dry blanket, the dignity of a hot meal, the kindness of a seat near the fire, the quiet luxury of sleeping without fear of the cold. In that sense, winter was not just a season. It was a teacher. It taught humility. It taught preparation. It taught people who they could rely on. It taught that comfort was not softness, but stability. And it taught that civilization itself can be measured in very small things, whether the old are warm enough, whether the sick are cared for, whether strangers are welcomed inside before dark. So the next time we imagine medieval Europe, it may be worth looking past the stone towers and banners for a moment. Picture instead a narrow room in deep winter, a fire carefully banked for the night, boots drying by the hearth, a child already asleep, someone quietly checking the shutters one last time, someone else counting tomorrow's fuel in their head. Outside, frost settling over fields no one can yet work. And inside, in that fragile circle of heat, the real history of the age continuing, quietly, patiently, one winter night at a time. If this part of the past surprised you most, I'd love to know what details stayed with you. The smoke, the shared warmth, the winter kitchens, or the simple cost of keeping a fire alive. And if you enjoy these calm journeys into the past, stay with us for more stories history usually leaves in the background. Until next time, sleep well and keep the fire warm.